Darkness cannot root out darkness, only light can. Hate cannot remove hate, only love can. These are the words of Dr. Martin Luther King when he was talking about how Black people should gather around in resistance of the Black oppression. Now, my name is Fresha Diana, and I'll be talking to you about Black resistance over the years and up to date currently. Let's begin first by understanding the history of the Black History Month. It was first termed the Negro Week back in the 1600s when it was introduced for people to consolidate and come around together to fight around the threats that faced them as Black people who had migrated particularly into the American era. Now, when you look at that history, we want to focus on why they were brought there. The history comes from a very in-depth position of slavery, a very troubled and a traumatic era that they lived in into forced migration. The history of the Black History Month begins in the 1600s when thousands of Black people were forced to migrate due to slavery and being captured and forced to go work into plantation. We can connotate the growth of the American forced labor being on the back of the African American. The majority of its economy relied on forced labor as well as manual labor before the advent of the industrialization. Now, when you look at this, you find that majority of the Black people were displaced from their homes, taken, stolen, kidnapped, and their lives were uprooted from their natural heritage back in Africa. Now, this is very important for us to set a context as to why we understand the Black resistance that exists today. Why is this necessarily important? To understand where we're going to, we have to know where we've come from. And this is very crucial in the sense that we're celebrating the Black History Month. Now, when you look at importance of why slavery happened, it's very traumatic experience that these African Americans went through because they wanted to go back to their roots, but they could not. They had been in forced labor under the Jim Crow laws, whereby they were being forced and imprisoned during their time, forced slavery and everything that was killing them and forcing them to hash it out. First, we would like to look at three concepts. We'd like to look at the history in the civilization era, then the Civil War, and then we looked at the forced migration and then voluntary migration. Going into the Civil War, after setting this context of history, Black people retaliated massively. They wanted to stop the killings. They wanted to stop the brutality. They wanted to be identified and get away from the racial segregation that they'd been going through systematically since the 1600s. With this in mind, why would then be it important that we celebrate the resistance that has come from far, from the civilization era, to understand why the Civil War actually happened, how slavery ended, and where we've come from then? The Civil War happened in the 1960s, whereby Black people rallied together to protest against the Jim Crow laws, which were imprisoning them, which was segregating them and discriminating against them to actually be killed and be jailed just for being a Black person in the American state. This was very detrimental to how the African American history has been perceived to date. The Civil War occurred in order for them to now bring about laws that would actually change their lives, improve the quality of lives, because you find that people have to now fight for their rights, have to fight for the right to work, have to fight for the right to vote, fight for the right to even live. That was how bad the Civil War was needed back in the 1960s. This brought about a lot of change in terms of scrapping out laws, giving legitimacy to Black voters for them to actually fight. We found women movements uprising that was giving them a chance to actually fight for their lives. This shaped the narrative as to why it is important to acknowledge that the African American is also an American, part of the Native Americans and the Americans. And this was crucial to be imprinted in the minds of the American people to accept black people as part of their population. Now, further from that, we look at now the forced migration era. This comes about to be seen where people are being forcefully moving to the American because their country can no longer sustain them in terms of climate refugees, political refugees, and also economic refugees, whereby countries go into unsustainability and they have to move into greener pastures for them to be able to grow. This created some form of resistance in the sense that they can deny their cultural heritage by not acknowledging where they've come from. They feel hurt by being forced out of their homeland and having to move to a new land whereby this is not your home, this is not your era, this is not your people. You have to abandon it. And that form of resistance is very evident for people who are actually forced, people who were victims of genocide, victims of war crimes and crimes against humanity that they had to move in. Now that identity is lacking. Now this is the population that we can call some of the African American, not the black people. The distinction between the two is that people who pride in their heritage from where they come from, but they choose not to relate to because they've been forced out of their homes and having to move to where it is safer for them and their family. This form of resistance is very evident that they have to abandon their heritage to uptake a new heritage and have to follow through by living with these living standards. But still they have to face racial discrimination, racial inequality, and even segregation in schools, in even social amenities and hospitals. And this was very key to shape the mind of those people who were forced into migration. That form of resistance is something that is hardly discussed in today's society, which I feel should be discussed on a large scale. When you move to a new environment, you have to adapt because, as the saying goes, when you go to Rome, you do as the Romans do. And this has shaped the narrative that people are abandoning their cultural heritage, their background, their Africanacity, because they've been forced. That hatred is vented onto their homeland and not onto the American heritage. And this has been a problem whereby people go there and move there and start a family there, but they would not identify with their own people back at home. And this resistance is very bad because you find people losing their heritage. Kids, particularly of the biracial couples, cannot find a footing or cannot trace their ancestry because their parents have abandoned their cultural heritage simply because they were forced to move out of their homes because of, let's say, political crimes. You might also find that in forms of this forced migration, we look at people who particularly moved out just because their political affiliation forced them to move out. And this is very evident even in the Kenyan setup. You see families moving out and they say because they do not align with any political stance, they feel that they would rather move out as opposed to aligning with particular political agendas. And this has made people to actually move out. And this is a form of forced migration because people do not align with what the political arena of the country looks like. And it has forced so many people to abandon their heritage because they cannot identify or they do not want to even affiliate with their heritage back at home simply because of a disagreement in terms of your political affiliation. And in conclusion with that, this has brought about a form of negativity towards the African stereotype in the sense that you cannot even identify yourself with your national heritage, much less your cultural heritage, if you cannot even want to go back to your home because of particular reasons. Certain countries have been unstable and people still do not want to go back because they feel what was done unto them the first time they experienced that forced migration makes them not want to channel back their roots back home. Now, this is now the voluntary migration where people actively choose to move out. Now, how do you see the Black resistance in that? People want to abandon their cultures. People want to abandon their heritage because they feel it is not making them have a sense of identity. You're losing your identity in the sense that I want to look for greener pastures. I want to sought after a Swedish citizenship or a Finnish citizenship, and that is inherently problematic, because when you voluntarily look for greener pastures, it's not a bad thing, but it comes in the form of resistance that you want to abandon your entire heritage back at home because you feel this is where you settle best, in these greener pastures. And that has formed a narrative of people wanting to live abroad as opposed to staying back at home. And to conclude on that, I'd feel that black tax is what is majorly making people voluntarily migrate, because you find people, when they move abroad, they have baggage back at home and they're forced to give back remittance to their people back at home. And this is very problematic because it steers people, it now makes people want to go away from you. They do not want to come back home from you. And this is inherently not a good thing for the society to experience. I believe that looking for greener pastures doesn't necessarily mean you have to uproot your entire life elsewhere and abandoning your cultural heritage. And this resistance is now cropping up in the new era of the generation that we're living in, where people abandon their culture because they want to be multilingual, they want to be multicultural, and that inherently is very problematic, because what are we without our own heritage? If you cannot choose to support your own heritage and seek your heritage in other, it's inherently problematic, and that crops up a problem of identity and black resistance for your cultural heritage. And I feel that this month is very important for us to understand black resistance, from where it has come from, how it cropped up, how it has improved the lives of black people abroad, and why it is important for them to connotate and affiliate with their cultural heritage. Thank you.